So we've got some time here for questions. We'd like to open it up to people if they have a question for folks in the armchair discussion. If not, I'll just keep firing questions at them. Oh, I see we have a taker. If you could identify yourself, Chris, that would be great.
Thanks, Monica. My name's Chris with Limbus Energy. I mean, before Nick left, I really liked his remarks and also with David's. To me, one of the issues, the question of the panel is credibility here. And I think from the narrative of a project like what's happening with Kinder Morgan or other projects that may be renewable and non-renewable, you have to look at things that have happened recently that have led to the public assuming there isn't credibility with any project, let alone not having a roadmap. I'll just point to a couple. When you decide to, and they both were consequences on Indigenous, economic, and environment. So let's look at Muskrat Falls and let's look at Site C. So here there were major projects driven through largely by governments in the participation sometimes with utilities. The homework was not done in both cases of what the economic impacts would be. In the case of the environment, they had impacts. In the case of the Indigenous, they had impact. So what you have is a situation when you're trying to engender confidence, you both need a vision as I would say more a vision, more a roadmap, like the language you were using to go forward, but you also have to appreciate that the credibility has been eroded. So what we have to do is to talk where the credibility has been positive. And that's where we have done things right. But you've got some projects out there that really, frankly, don't look very good. And they've been very public, and there's no, the trust level, the real trust challenge with the trust here is that we've eroded most of the trust that Canadians would give to these projects. And I think that's a really sobering situation for where we're at. So the question of the panel is, in light of that reality, what's the one or two things that start to begin to build trust? Because it's a pretty big uphill road.
Thoughts?
Well, you know, one of the things that I've experienced over the course of my career is it's uncomfortable, but you have to start with prepared to being engaged in the conversations. And you know, I think it was stated earlier, a lot of times what we hear is the noise from the edges, but don't hear what the majority in the middle feel and see. So to do that, you actually have to go out and find them. You have to go out and engage directly with them. And that's why I still think one of the bigger challenges is not the local stakeholders, it's the wider ones, which is what is the mechanism to go do that? And how do we get past just the loud voices who have the strongest view to the majority and what their view is, and how do we bring that to the surface? Some of the survey data I was actually surprised by. I was surprised to see how most Canadians probably don't have as an extreme and as jaundiced a view as maybe has been portrayed even here today. That it seemed like we shouldn't take that for granted, but it sounded to me like they had a more balanced view, and this is one of many issues they're thinking about, but maybe not the strongest issue. So we shouldn't take that for granted. We should think about how we effectively communicate with them, how we embed their thoughts into the process as well, as we go about you know, shaping the direction for the future.
Okay. What else? Louis?
Well, going back to trust and in a way fate in the process, I think I'm part of a pretty good group of people. Regulators in Canada generally are respected. They are seen as transparent. They are seen as credible authorities that, you know, that make decisions based on science and fact. Generally speaking, we all know about the NEB, and we all know about the panel for Energy East retiring because they had met with Jean Charest. That's nothing that's helpful in a situation to bring credibility to the regulator. But this being put aside, regulators are generally credible, but is it their job? Should we ask them to do the full length of the job to get the population to buy into projects, to buy into solutions? I'm not sure, and in fact, I don't even think so. I think regulators can be used, and when I talked about my own apprehensions as a lawyer for this public consultation, I read an article recently. It's allegations of bias in administrative law processes, and let me read just a little phrase.
Scintillating stuff, Louis. I'm just saying.
Just a little phrase. When a litigant has incorrect expectations regarding a particular aspect of adjudicative procedure or an inflated understanding of their own rights at a given point in the process, Any conduct by an adjudicator that does not accord with those expectations is liable to give the litigant an apprehension of bias, thus mistrust. And essentially, I think it's the role of the regulators to go out there and inform the public of what the process is, how it works, and at least you may not agree with the final decision. You may not agree with the outcome. But if you trust the process and you trust that everybody's been given a fair chance to present their own positions and that all of the information has been taken into account, well, I think we have gone a long way towards bringing credibility to energy-making decisions.
Monica, if I can just add one thought to that. In order to build trust, you also have to have respect. And this evening, I think we had a respectful dialogue going on on a tough subject in a way that made some people in the room uncomfortable. But it wasn't a lack of respect. And I think it worked and it helped keep ears open. It doesn't help when you have language that's very vexatious and very, just meant to be explosive. If you have the head of a Crown corporation calling a project a boondoggle, then you're probably not building up that kind of a dialogue about what exactly the project's all about, where it might have gone wrong, and how it might be improved in the future. So it's respectful language and as respectful conversations are part of, far from the only, but it's part of trust.
Kim.
Trust is pretty straightforward from my perspective. It's having reliable information that you can count on. You know that it's not being sugar-coated by whatever side's advancing it. And I think that's a major problem these days. It's really hard to know where you can get information that you can trust. At least it is for me. From an Indigenous perspective, First Nations have really not built good, trusting relationship with governments for good reasons. I mean, all the policies that were created were meant to sort of step over Indigenous rights and title. And now you have people saying they want to start afoot with a new relationship, nation to nation, respect the UNDRIP sort of framework, new frameworks in Canada. But it comes down to doing what you commit to do and sort of following through on those things, and it's really quite simple. And if you can't, follow through on those commitments, you will never gain trust.
David.
Well, one of the things I think is also important is to actually tell some good stories about some things that have actually worked well. I did a reasonable amount of work a while ago with the mining industry, and I was quite struck by the fact that Canada has some of the worst practices and some of the best practices in the world when it comes, for example, to working with Aboriginal peoples. And the example of the diamond mines in the territories is a very good one. I mean, it works extremely well. The whole concept of co-management was essentially invented in Canada. It's now being used for many of the national parks in the north. It's being used for the big park up near Churchill in Manitoba. These things actually work quite well, and there are plenty of people from the Aboriginal side that are prepared to say, yes, we're part of this process, and we think it works well as well. A good deal of the Plan Nord in Quebec is like that as well. So, I think there is some quite good experience in Canada. I think of Chris Henderson and his, how many, Chris, projects, renewable energy projects with developing countries? 200. Nobody knows that. What we know are the things that don't work. I invite you to read his book. That's what he's done almost full-time for the last 4 or 5 years, is to work with small Indigenous communities to build their own energy supply. So there's lots of that stuff around. And I don't think it obviously doesn't make it into the public discourse in a way it can. And if it does, then we won't just concentrate on the things that blew up in our face and concentrate on the fact that we have actually learned something over the last 100 years and that we might want to try and put that into practice more.
So we have 2 more questions. Time is beginning to run tight, so I'd like to invite each of you to give a brief question. We'll take both of them and then get some responses from the panel before closing. Go ahead.
George Green. I'm focused on Bruce's comment about the risk-reward equation. So the question to the panel is, how do you bring people who are at the interface of the risk-reward equation into decision-making processes so they feel confident with the outcomes?
Second question?
My name is Patrick McCurdy. I'm a professor in the communications department. So I take an active interest in the ongoing sort of media image war, the sort of binary in this debate, sort of for and against oil sands versus tar sands. So my question is, how do we break that binary and have a discussion? How can, I'm a communications scholar, but how can public policy be used to break that, what is an endless sort of image media war? How can public policy intervene in this discussion?
So risk reward and overcoming binary images. And Jeff, there's lots of time tomorrow. You can jump in tomorrow. Quick responses from the panel. Yeah, Bruce.
On the dilemma in terms of the media, advice that I've given ministers over a fair period of time was always the best public policy is one that actually can be explained, can be backed up and demonstrated that it's a viable one. It may not be the policy wonk, and I've dealt with a lot of my colleagues who are very much technically minded and had to continually remind them that an optimal technical solution may not be the best public policy solution for the very reason you're talking about, is that if you can't explain it and you can't demonstrate that it's effective and a good one, then I don't care how optimal it is. It's not a bad public policy decision.
Other thoughts on either of the questions? Doug?
Well, I just want to pick up on something David said. You know, we were involved, it culminated last year with bringing 3 large new natural gas processing plants on in British Columbia. And they're a little unique because they're run on hydroelectricity. And if you follow that stream of natural gas, and if it went to the coast of British Columbia and was liquefied using partial power from hydro and landed as LNG in Asia, it would have less than half the carbon content of natural gas liquefied on the Gulf Coast of Texas. And of course, then if you take that natural gas and displace coal, that will cut another 60% of the emissions down. And I think this gets to part of the information issue. I think a lot of people aren't informed of how Canada can play a role that's bigger than just about Canada. It's about the whole world, because there's a whole lot of places where oil and natural gas is produced where you do not have access to hydroelectricity. So this opportunity doesn't exist. But without information about things like that, how can people make balanced decisions? Particularly, as others on the panel have said, if most of the information presented to them is all the cases where something didn't go in the way they wanted it to go, and if that isn't balanced out. So we have to find a way to do this. And the other thing I think we have to find a way to do is, how do we get information in front of people and how they get it today? The traditional media is not the way most people make decisions and gather information, but it's now come with this trust problem, which is, where do I find stuff I can rely on, and who can I do that to? And I think with energy, it's been building. Minister Carr talked about the IEA is one, the EIA is another, but we need to have more places where people feel they can go to and find information that they believe has been checked and verified.
Other thoughts on those questions? Well, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity, one thought before we close, when it comes to what do we need to focus on moving forward? What's your #1 priority for Canada moving forward when it comes to public confidence issues and strengthening public confidence in energy decision making? And we'll move again from the far end back towards me, if that works for you, Kim.
I guess I think it's critically important that Canada resolves Indigenous issues on a separate track to energy issues. And to me, I sense a real urgency in relation to sustainability of Indigenous communities is as equally as important as energy issues. And I believe there will be synergies in relation to those issues, especially when you talk about First Nations wanting to get off diesel and do things in their own communities, or even go beyond and be equity participants in major energy projects to develop their own economies. So there's a huge range of solutions there, but I think we can't lose track of that issue either.
Terrific. Bruce?
I'm inspired by the number of people who have raised the issue about energy information, and that is a part of trust. I think it's also ease of access to that information. It needs to be organized in a way that actually answers the questions that are plugged into Google or whatever. And you have to be able to get access to something that's credible, and we have work to do in that area.
Louis?
Nick earlier talked about the silent majority, and for most Canadians, their interest is energy, is when they put the switch on, when they walk in their house, they want the power to be there. They want the lights to go on, they want it to be affordable, they want it to be safe, and that's the scope of their interest in energy. And then there's the prosumers, or the people that are really interested in issues. Naturally, the First Nations, they have vested interest in project development on their lands, and then there's special rights groups or whatever that also have an interest. But for the majority of people, they want the lights to go on, and I think we all have a duty, governments, policymakers, regulators, industry, to make sure that when we make decisions, they're well informed and that we do educate the public. And I'm not saying this in a negative sense, but in the sense that we have a duty to inform, and the dialogue must go on. It's simple as that.
David?
Yeah, I guess the ultimate question for me, sooner or later, we are going to have to move to a low-carbon future. And the science tells us it's certainly no later than 2050. I guess there are two questions. One is that there's no narrative as to what that looks like. We go on and on about a low-carbon economy and so on. There's no vision of what it would look like, what daily life would look like, would people still have jobs, etc. And so there's a need for involvement of perhaps artists and poets trying to look at what the future might actually be for a low-carbon economy. And the challenge, I guess, for Canada is, can you maintain a lively fossil fuel industry at a time when much of the rest of the world is beginning to shift to a different set of energy sources? I was quite taken last week. I hosted a meeting of the Shell scenario people. They've just produced their new scenario called Sky. And they are not predicting, because these aren't predictions, but they're constructing a set of assumptions about peak oil demand being 2025. That's tomorrow. That doesn't bode well for very, very expensive sources of oil as a future. So these are, I'd say, interesting. They're vital challenges for Canada. And we're not having that discussion much at all. And I think if that's what positive energy were to do next, it would be doing everybody an enormous favor.
Thanks, David. We'll write that down somewhere. Doug?
You know, we participated in Generation Energy that Minister Carr kicked off, and one of the things we held is we hosted an event with 70 millennials in our office in Calgary, and these millennials came from NGOs, they came from government, they came from universities, they came from the energy industry, and we had a series of speakers, experts on energy, people from our industry and others. And what was interesting is that these millennials came in and thought they had an understanding and a view. And at the end of the day, they wrote a report which became part of the Generation Energy Dialogue. And one of the first conclusions they came to in that report was, this is such an important topic, it's more important to get it right than to do it fast. And there was a perception coming in that it was just the opposite, that urgency was here. But once they understood the complexity of how energy touches everyone's life and understood that these policy decisions would touch people in many, many ways, that figuring out how to do this right was more important than figuring out how to rush into it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything, but it does mean it's going to take some dialogue. And I agree, how do you take a topic this complex and translate it to ways that people can understand how it touches their life, not only today, but generations from today, and help them see a pathway through that they can make sense of.
Yeah. And yet I think, you know, one of the things that we've seen from the public opinion research is that there's an appetite for that, and there's a sense of optimism and wanting to be engaged and engage in a pragmatic fashion. So I'm conscious of time, but there were just a couple of things I wanted to point out that struck me, and I hope we can continue on these roads over the next day. One that really comes out to me is we need to have the right forums to talk about the right things. And again, we've talked about this at Positive Energy over the last number of years, but I think it's becoming all the more important, notably when it comes to shifts to lower carbon energy systems. I think one of the things that also came forward really strongly for me as well is, you know, it's not just about kind of who decides and what's the process and what do policymakers do and what do regulators do. Yes, those are essential, and I could completely agree, Louis, with the need to get that right. But it's also about the credibility of the process. So whatever that process is, to make sure we've got a process that at the end of the day, people can have the sense, yes, that was a credible process, it's a legitimate process, I had an opportunity to be heard. And that's not just for individuals. I think that's also for corporations, it's also for investors. As you said, Doug, they need to have the sense that they can come into a country and have a good understanding of what the rules of the game are and what's expected of them in that context. So this, I think, gives us lots of grist for tomorrow's discussions. We'll be moving into dinner now. We have a keynote speech from Chief Karina Lewin, who is the Vice Chair of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, so we're really looking forward to that. Dinner will be served very shortly. In the meantime, I would like to invite you to join me in thanking the Armchair Discussion participants for a terrific session.